See, I know a few more people will still be coming in, but I think I'll try to get us started anyway, so we leave plenty of time for Gavin to answer questions after his presentation. My name is Don Wibbles. I'm the past president of the Global Environmental Change Focus Group. I welcome you all to the Stephen Schneider lecture, which we started several years ago. Last year's lecture was given by Warren Washington, and at that lecture I learned, as I was introducing him, that he was not a fellow of AGU. So we fixed that this year, and now I've learned that Gavin is not a fellow of AGU. So we need to fix that one too. So somebody get going on that one. You have to March 15th to get all the paperwork in. Yes. Steve Schneider, who died in 2010, was an extremely influential scientist with extensive national and international recognition for his research, policy analyses, and outreach related to climate and climate change. Not only was Steve an outstanding scientist, he was also known as a great communicator. So it's a real honor for us today to have another great communicator. Gavin Schmidt is, again, not only an outstanding scientist who I kind of share to some small degree in trying to also work on climate models as he does and trying to make them better understand them and make them better. The other thing I know we've shared is being attacked in the media for the work we've done on connection with the climate system. So Gavin is also a great communicator. He won the 2011 Climate Communication Prize from AGU, and so it's really wonderful to have him here today. We want to honor him for his outstanding scientific accomplishments in connected with global environmental change in our focus group, and in communicating scientific results in the public. And for that, we have a small token of our appreciation by giving Gavin a small certificate for this. So let me honor that by Gavin by presenting that to him. And what he's going to do today is Gavin's going to talk about what should a climate scientist advocate for. And I'll turn it over to Gavin and let him get started.
So, let me just. So, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, well, thank you very much. I am both flattered and somewhat terrified to give this talk. Some of you may have heard of imposter syndrome, where you suddenly find yourself in a position where you think that you can only have possibly got there by mistake, and suddenly you're going to wake up and suddenly everyone's going to realize that they've made a terrible mistake. Yeah. So Stephen Schneider, as Don mentioned, died a few years ago and was really a giant in our field in many, many respects. And I met him many times. I wouldn't call ourselves, bosom buddies. I mean, some people here have known him for 40, 50 years. But I knew him, and I appreciated greatly the help and mentoring that he gave me when I was first starting to talk about climate change in public. And you'll see that his thinking kind of permeates this entire talk. In fact, I have a confession. My confession is this: while I have thought a lot about issues of advocacy and communication and what's good and what's bad and what's responsible and what's not, and my thinking over the years has changed. Like at the beginning, I was very naive about how this all worked, and I would like to think that I've become a little bit more sophisticated in how I think about these things. I started researching this talk, and I said, oh, you know what, I'll put in some video clips from Steve in here, and I start looking at all of his videos. I can't look at all of them because there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of Steve Schneider videos, which it would take years and years and years to actually watch. But I did find, with some help from James Arnott from the Aspen Global Change Institute, some clips which were really very good. And I realized that everything I actually wanted to say in this talk was said by Steve 20 and 30 years ago and said over and over and over again. And I feel a little bit embarrassed that basically you're not going to hear anything new here, right? Maybe with a few modern twists, but basically everything I'm going to talk about is stuff that if you knew Steve 20 years ago, you would have heard directly from the horse's mouth. So I confess, I have nothing new to say. As you're all aware, the New York Times sometimes publishes rather lame editorials which try and demonstrate that pollution of any particular sort is not a problem, and we should just breathe easier and just not worry our pretty little heads about what we're doing to the environment. This was on August 28th. You'll be pleased to know it was in 1971. And it contained this particular little gem, which is, then there is the greenhouse effect theory. The buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so goes this particular idiocy, will cause a temperature increase throughout the planet. Now, whether he actually thought that it would actually warm the planet through to the core is a little bit uncertain, but the science in this particular editorial was really quite bad. This was at the time when Steve Schneider had just written his first paper. He had a paper in Science with Razul about aerosol forcing and carbon dioxide effects. And I think he was thinking, I should do something about this. Now, I remember being at that stage and doing something very similar. So he wrote a letter to the editor. This was him back in 1971 with somebody who, he seems familiar, but I don't think I've seen him this week. He sent a letter to the editor and said, the opinion that we are winning the war against pollution by Guccione is based upon conclusions that are both inaccurate and certainly misleading. So you can see straight away, I'm not going to take this anti-science nonsense there. You see he signed that as Steve Schneider. The newspaper phoned him up and said, well, can we have an affiliation for you? And he told them what his affiliation was. And at the time, he was a postdoc at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which I am now the deputy director of. So that's another little link. And whether it was because it mentioned the Goddard Institute, or whether it kind of, in a slightly Russian way, said that he is atmospheric scientist, as opposed to an atmospheric scientist, or the atmospheric scientist. This got the attention of Bob Jastrow, who was the then head of GISS, and he was not one to be upstaged in the media, and he fired Steve immediately. Steve was reinstated after a little bit of back and forth with NASA headquarters, but Steve got the message and moved to NCAR quite soon afterwards. I'd like to think that NASA GISS is a slightly more welcoming place to people who write letters to the editor these days. Now, the interesting thing about this letter is that all the way through it, and you should go and read it, all the way through, he's really talking about science. It's science facts, this is wrong, this is what you should conclude, blah, blah, blah. And then right at the end, there's a single line which says, what we need to do is have an accelerated program of scientific research with improved international cooperation. Pretty trivial. But you know what? That's advocacy, right? That's telling us what we should be doing. So this is what I'm going to talk about, is this connection between science and advocacy and communication. So here's a little pop quiz. So I know you just had lunch and you're probably feeling a little soporific, but I'm going to ask you to put up your hands to answer this question. So I'm going to put up a number of statements, and what I want to know is whether you'd be happy saying this statement in public, or on the Facebook page, or to a journalist, or something like that, okay? So, first statement. Scientists should communicate more about what they do and find. So raise your hand if you think that that's something that you would say in public, okay? That's a lot of hands. Funding for scientific research should be a higher priority. People should understand the basics of the greenhouse effect. Okay. Global warming should be in the high school science curriculum. Slightly less, but still a lot. Geoengineering should be seriously considered. Right? There should be a price on carbon emissions. Okay. The only solution to global warming is nuclear power. Okay. Now, I put them down in the line that I thought would go to like a diminishing number of people, and I got that wrong actually. So that's interesting. But the fact is that all of those statements are normative, right? They say what should happen. They are not statements about what is, right? All of these statements are advocacy, right? Let's be very clear. Advocating for greater scientific research, for greater public understanding, for better science education, all of these things are advocacy.
All right, let's talk about advocacy. What does that mean?
That was my first clip. I learned how to do video editing like last night. It was really quite exciting. So there we are. We all agreed that we are happy to advocate for various things. And yet the term has a resonance in the scientific community which is very negative, right? So this is a cartoon, and so here the advocate who dresses better and is clean-shaven, and it's all about, the implications, data transmission, whatever, blah, blah. And then the scientist, the pure scientist, the noble searcher after truth who can't even be bothered to shave, is so excited about his science, right? That's what a scientist is. That's not an advocate, right? And I've done the same thing too. I mean, I wrote a piece back in 2009 where I took advocacy as like all the worst things about people cherry-picking scientific results to fit their preconceived notions. And that was contrasted with again, the pure and noble scientist that I imagined myself to be. But I think I got that wrong. I think I definitely got that wrong. And then more earlier this year, there was an interesting editorial in The Guardian from a climate scientist in the UK who advocated that climate scientists should not advocate any particular policies. And that generated a very interesting set of discussions online and in person, and was really kind of top of my mind when I was asked to do this talk. And so that's been quite motivating. Okay, so we have this confusion here, right? I'll give you a couple more examples of how it's confused. So you can become an advocate just by association, right? So there was a paper published in the Public Understanding of Science journal where they did a search through the newspaper database for all mentions of global warming, climate change, the greenhouse effect. And what they did was they collated the names of scientists in those articles, right? So this is the list of scientists that came up: Jim, Mike Mann, Kevin Trember, Steve Schneider, and there's me, right? So I was like, oh, that's nice. And I looked at the articles that they pulled out for me. And they're all talking about, whether it was warm this year or not warm this year, what happened in the 8,200 years ago in the 8.2 kiloyear event. And there was one profile in there in which I did advocate for something. And they said, well, what should we do in New York? And I said, don't buy basement property in Battery Park City, which, since that was written in 2006, I think was pretty prescient. But in the paper, they declare that all of these scientists are clearly advocates who use their knowledge gains to advance ambitious climate mitigation targets, despite the fact that they didn't read any of these papers and they didn't see whether anybody was advocating for anything in particular. Now, that might be true for Jim. I don't know if it was true for anybody else, but they didn't check, right? They just assumed that because we were scientists and that we were in the media, that we were advocates for something that they thought about. So if you talk about science, people will assume that you are advocating for some specific policy, generally what they most disagree with, usually. Thomas Stocker, somebody you all know, they just made a video to talk about the IPCC report. And at the end of this video, there's a statement: continued greenhouse gas emissions cause further climate change and constitute a multi-century commitment in the future. Therefore, we conclude limiting climate change requires substantial and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's not a normative statement. That's a factual statement, as best we understand the science. And yet, the instant that went up, some people, including other IPCC authors, immediately said, no, that's advocacy, right? So this is all very confusing. I'll give you an example of what we had before, right? So Brian Cox, he's a very high-profile scientist TV scientist and scientist in the UK, is very happy to write letters to the government and publicize them, asking for more research funding and then making that a higher priority, something I think we probably all agree with. But when asked whether you agree with the statement that climate scientists should not advocate particular policies, he thought that was spot on. So what's the difference between his view of himself as an advocate for higher funding, better understanding, and his view of us, me, not being able to talk about policies that are associated with our science, right? This is very confusing. So let's try and kind of pin it down a little bit. So let's just quickly summarize. The term advocacy and advocate is seen as problematic in the community. I mean, well, let's just do another pop quiz. If somebody called you an advocate, just kind of flat out, would you feel that that was a positive thing or a negative thing? So positive. Oh, negative. Oh, actually, that's about half-half. That's interesting. Okay, that was not what I expected. The main objection to the term is that people see it as a threat to this perception that exists that science is a perfectly objective affair. Now, we're all scientists. We know that the decisions that we make in choosing what to study, choosing how to study it, and choosing who to get back at because they really wrote a terrible paper and I'm going to prove that they're wrong, right? It's not completely objective. Right? We are human beings, we have our egos, we have our biases, we have our values that are different. But we have this perception of objectivity, that everything that we do has to be perfectly objective, and we have to pretend that it is. And so when you see someone being described as an advocate, you think, oh, well, maybe their science isn't objective. It's clearly used as a pejorative term to kind of delegitimize scientific voices. This happens quite a lot. And yet, as we saw, we generally, among ourselves, see no problem in advocating for science in general, more research funding, public understanding and engagement, and ourselves, right? I mean, there's a number of scientists who will remain nameless who are very good at advocating for themselves. So this isn't consistent, it's not coherent, and I think it's not very effective. So,
Sure, but what makes this an interesting problem, and interesting I use somewhat sarcastically, is the only way to prove that for sure is to perform the experiment on us. And that's why you have a debate about whether to do something about it before it's proved beyond doubt. And that's not an issue of science, that's an issue of value, something Walt taught me many years ago. How to choose what to do in the face of uncertainty is never a scientific question. The science is elucidating the possibilities and the probabilities, but how to act and how to react is your own values, and we always have to make that explicit. But if you don't have any information, it's hard to know how to apply your values in more than a random way, and that's the challenge for education, both for us and also for our kids. Well, let's move on now.
I like it that the technology has not really improved very much since 1990. Okay, no, click, see, it's much better. So let's break that down, right? Science and values, those are two different things. We are scientists, we have our different values. The science you can think of as describing what is, what has been, what our understanding of the processes are. And our values are what we think should be prioritized over other things. What do we think are important? What do we think is not important? Those things are much more individual, and we can probably agree more on the science than we can on the values. Though within a particular group like this, we might actually agree on a lot of values as well. Advocacy is a combination of these two things, right? Advocacy, the should terms, what should we do in the face of the understanding that we've got from the science and with the understanding of our own values, what should we do about X? What should we do about pollution? What should we do about acid rain, ozone holes, and the like, right? The advocacy comes from that combination of the two, and Steve Schneider was very clear about that in almost all of his talks. Now, what is the situation that we find ourselves in? We find ourselves talking about a science that has become very politicized. We find ourselves in an environment where politics is sometimes very scientized. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Science gets politicized when the implications of the science kind of impinge on things that people hold far more dear, whether it's a religious issue, a moral issue, a political issue. People hold those kinds of values much closer to their chest than they do the scientific method. And so when we have a vested interest that science appears to impact, then we can have a lot of politicization. Right? What happens in that case? Well, new results about that science get seen in the public only to the extent that they project onto this political, ethical, or moral question. So really interesting science that really is orthogonal to what the public debate is doesn't get mentioned. Something that kind of tangentially projects onto that can get a lot of attention. Politics kind of follows from that, and you get this scientized politics where you find politicians and talking heads arguing about 15th century tree rings as if A, that was important, or B, they knew anything about the 15th century or a tree or rings, right? It has nothing to do with the real scientific debate, right? It sounds science-y, right? But it's used to make a case. It's not used to investigate the truth. It's just used as a cudgel to advance somebody's agenda. And so what you get in those circumstances is cherry-picking of results, straw man arguments that nobody believes so that you can just chop them down, and red herring points that nobody is actually disputing. Doonesbury, this is from the mid-2000s, he said, drat, those pesky scientific facts won't line up behind my beliefs. Then challenge them, Stewie, challenge them, right? That's how we should, that's how people thought about these things. So there are consequences to this environment that we find ourselves in, right? There are some that are good. If you have a scientific result that does project onto this media debate, it is easier to get it into Nature and Science. And I apologize to any editors for Nature and Science who may be in the room or watching. Sorry, Heike. But having that general interest part is an important factor in getting something in a high-profile journal, and things that are associated with faux debates that get a lot of press kind of fall into that category. You will get media coverage and interest in your work. Sometimes you can have people and they're just calling up, every 10 minutes, and you're going, oh my God, people like what I do. I'm interesting to them, and that's pleasing, right? We don't want to just toil away in obscurity. Well, some of us do, but I don't. We want people to be interested in what we do, and so this allows us to do that. If you fill a niche that is empty in that kind of popular debate, that is a stepping stone to getting a lot of attention, being invited to testify, being invited to write op-eds, being invited onto panels, because you're that person that fills that niche. So that can be good for particular people. Bad consequences. Because this is a politicized environment, your papers are going to be misquoted and used out of context almost all the time. It turns out that politics is not as nice as science. I've never seen anybody come to blows at an AGU conference. That is not the case in political forum. The scientists become under much more public scrutiny because right now the shoot the messenger strategy becomes a much more valid way of going about the argument, and that doesn't happen so much in science. The media reports about your papers are generally not accurate, false balance, where you've got 90% of people who agree with one thing, and you've got one person who still thinks that the Earth is flat, and these things are balanced in a way that's very confusing. There's a lot of sensationalism. There's a lot of overinterpretation, which obviously the best science journalists don't do, but a lot of times when it's a public issue, it doesn't go to the best science journalists. It goes to the beat reporter, who is basically trying to do 10 stories a day, and they don't have time to work out what's going on. And of course, constant debate of irrelevancies gets in the way and crowds out serious discussion. And this is perhaps the most important part of that. So, but things have changed since the 1990s, right? That clip that I showed you from Steve was back here, right, at the beginning, where at the time when TV was completely dominant and that newspapers, more than 50% of the people got their news from newspapers and the radio. And if you look now, so this is the latest data from 2012, people still watch TV, but not as much as they do. Newspapers are dropping almost by a half in terms of readership since the early 90s. And of course, the online component, how people get their information, is almost all, well, not quite almost all, but 40% of people get their news from online sources now. And if you include apps and Twitter feeds and the like, it's over 50% of people in the US now get their information from the internet. And this has changed something, right? At the beginning, when Steve was talking about advocacy and values, that was something that people looked at and they said, okay, well, it's good that he's thinking about that, because there was only like 4 people who were on TV or who were testifying who were always there, and they were doing it, right? And we didn't need to. With the new media environment, instead of the one-to-many broadcast model, we now have many-to-many. And many of us are tweeting, many of us have Facebook pages, and we've written apps, and we're trying to engage people all across the world in all sorts of different ways. Now, what was important for Steve and a couple of others 30 years ago is now important for a lot more of us in a lot more environments. So that has changed. So the questions that you have to ask when you start to communicate, of course, is why are you doing this, right? If I'm going to communicate to you, I have to have something to say, right? What is it that I think that I'm going to say to you, right? Why am I doing this? Now, it could be film criticism, right? You could be an advocate for better than third grade level physics in movies, right? I think that would be a good thing. You might be very interested in the political back and forth between the op-ed pages on the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Literary criticism, I think that's a good use of our time. There are some books that people really need to be warned off because there's only so many hours in your life that you don't want to be reading really, really bad books. But what should you communicate, right? I'm quite strategic in how I do public communication. I don't talk about what I had for breakfast. I don't talk about my family. I talk about science. I talk about, things that I'm coming across, people I'm coming across, and I'm trying to build context for the science that people are talking about or that they want to understand, right? But everybody has to decide that for themselves. What is it that you're going to communicate? Where are you going to communicate this, right? Are you going to write books? Are you going to be on a Twitter feed? Are you going to have a blog? Are you going to try and write letters to the editor? And then how do you do it, right? The actual mechanics of it. So right now I'm tweeting. I run a blog that's been going for almost 10 years now called Real Climate, where the idea was we would give people context, and so they'd understand better what they were seeing in the wider media. And for the most part, that has worked out. To the extent that we've now completely dealt with this problem. Not. So the key conclusion, though, is that if you're involved in communication, you're doing it for a reason. That reason is associated with what it is you are advocating for. So you can't divorce the two things. You can't be a science communicator and pretend you're not advocating for something. Right? You can't be a communicator and pretend that you have no values, right? What instead you need to do is accept that. Because if you don't, right, if you don't explicitly say that you're advocating for X, Y, or Z, people will just assume that you're advocating for A, B, and C because you haven't told them otherwise. And in a politicized environment, the default assumptions that people will make about you will not necessarily be very flattering, right? So people will assume things about what you're trying to do, and so you're going to be much better off owning that and defining it yourself and telling people what it is that you're going to advocate for before they just assume what you're going to do. They'll assume it anyway, but at least you can say, don't do that, read this, and just point them to that every single time.
We'll get to.
So
here are, all of these, of course, are value positions. Now, here's my prescription for being, quote, responsible. First, you make them conscious, because if you don't see them, you're not going to know what you're doing. And I get very frustrated and annoyed by people who are assertively value-free because their values remain unconscious. To me, they're more dangerous than the ones who are out there. I mean, they're almost worse than your friends in the Global Climate Coalition. At least they know what their values are. But then you've got a second obligation, and you're not responsible. And I would argue that's, you also not only have to make them conscious, but you have to make them explicit.
Right.
And there's a third obligation that I believe is part of responsible advocacy. Don't let them, meaning your value positions, distort your subjective priors on issues of, quote, fact. That is not a trivial thing to do, but I will assert that unconscious advocacy is worse on this point than conscious, and you really have to fight yourself. And then I would argue that you should defend your value positions. That's what advocacy is. It's defending a value position, but you should defend them as separately as you can from debates over the probabilities and consequences, which is sort of similar to this. So now that way, when I start giving an empirical case for this and show a couple of examples, if we don't get time to get back to it, at least I've gotten the bottom line out. And the problem is that many scientists, and not just scientists, but others are uncomfortable because they believe it is not possible. That's why the title was, is a scientist advocate an oxymoron? It is not possible to do this. So therefore, we will maintain the reality, or more likely pretense, of complete objectivity. We will not have value positions, and we will be entirely neutral. And I don't think that's actually true for anybody, even no matter how hard we strive. So that's why I try to argue about these first two are the most important.
So that sounds pretty familiar, right? So I will point out that there has been something that has changed since 1996. I think my slides are slightly better. Kevin, is Kevin Tremberth here? Is he somewhere here? He's very lucky that I didn't actually include the next little bit of that clip where he's looking very youthful and with a very interesting haircut at the time. Anyway. So, responsible advocacy, right? I think that is the key thing, because all the things that we think of as bad are really associated with irresponsible advocacy. So what are the differences, right? So Steve kind of outlined them a little bit. This is slightly different, but it's basically the same thing. What are your values, and represent them fairly, right? Don't tell people what your values are if they're not actually your values. Make connections between your policy choices and your values explicit, because then people can see what that chain of logic is, and they can decide to go along with you, or they can decide, okay, this is the point at which we part, right? That makes for a much better conversation. There are differences between personal conclusions that we have come to, I have come to, and that the broad mass of the scientific community might have come to. And, we don't think all in lockstep, and there are some things where I depart from the consensus, and there are other times when I think the consensus is pretty much spot on. And I'm sure for all of you, that would be a slightly different calculation, but those things will exist too. It's important that we acknowledge that people with different values would have different policies and different policy choices, even if the science was exactly the same and everybody accepted the science basis. And I think it's important that we do acknowledge that. And we should be aware of how our values might affect our priors, right? To what extent, and we have to be very, clear about this, to what extent do we think that we're working on something because we think that has a normative value? And we need to maintain vigilance on that. So what's irresponsible advocacy? Well, it's basically the opposite. You don't mention your values, or you misrepresent your values. You don't make the basis of your policy choices clear. And you just make a presumption that your personal scientific conclusions are actually what everybody else is going to conclude at the same time. And if you spend your time assuming that anybody who disagrees with you about policy is just an idiot because they don't follow the science, right, that is an error, right? And it's a pretty categorical error. And if you find yourself, if not obviously nobody here, if one finds oneself using science-y arguments as a cover for hidden differences in values, then you would know that you are an irresponsible advocate. With advocacy comes rights and also responsibilities, right? So what rights do we have? Okay, so I'm going to assert that you should have the right to advocate for anything you like, right? Whether you're working for the federal government, which I am, or the Canadian federal government, which some of you are, you should have the right to talk about anything you want at any time to anybody, as long as it's absolutely clear that you speak for yourself, right? So if I wasn't clear right at the beginning, I don't think I was, I am not here representing NASA. I am not speaking for NASA's policy position, of which it has none. I'm talking about myself, right? And I think that this is something that we should understand is a right, and that people across the world have the right to advocate for anything they want to. And you have a right not to advocate for anything at all. Right? You don't have to do this. If people want to bully you into supporting something that you don't think is in accord with your values, you have the total right to say, no, I don't think I need to do that, without having people think that you're abandoning your scientific credentials. But with advocacy comes responsibilities. To be explicit. To not assume that your values are shared by everybody. Now, a lot of the advocacy positions that we had that little pop quiz about earlier on, there was a lot of agreement about some of those statements. That's because we're a community that shares a number of values. We're a community that shares a value that says that science and the scientific method and progress are good things, that education is a good thing. But these are not universal values, right? If I was to ask whether scientific research should be prioritized in a room full of firemen, I don't think I'd have quite as much unanimity, right? It's not because they don't think, it's not because they're not as intelligent as us, or they're not as educated. They have different values and they have different priorities. And I think we have to be very clear that that's a responsibility of us when we advocate to recognize that. We have a responsibility to examine how our values might be shaping our assumptions. That's something that we have to do all the time. And of course, we shouldn't speak for our agency or our community unless they've actually asked us to do so. And I think this is always a good thing. You have a responsibility, if you're trying to communicate with somebody, is to listen first, speak later. And I know I don't always do that, but I think that's a wise thing. Okay. Now, Aristotle said this a long time ago. To avoid criticism, say nothing, do nothing, be nothing. As soon as you say something, do something, be someone, people will criticize you. And if you're the only person sticking your head above the parapet, then you become a target for people to criticize you. And there's a lot of people in this room who have felt that they have been the sole head above that parapet. Though what's happening is that that's changing, because you're not alone anymore, right? There are other people who are sticking their heads above the parapets as well. And it's actually much easier to deal with criticism if it's shared equally among all of the people whose heads happen to be there. And the people who are taking pot shots, there actually aren't that many of them. And when there's a lot of people, they start missing their targets. So that's just a slight digression. So let me address one little thing, again associated with Steve, and again associated with this idea of communication and advocacy. So the most quoted and misquoted statement that he ever made was this one. And it said, the double ethical bind, by which he meant that, if you condense something to a soundbite shorn of all its caveats, in some sense it can't possibly be right. But if you have a lot of people that are listening, you can't get them to read a whole book every time you want them to say something. So this balance between efficiency and honesty and explaining all of the caveats and things is a double ethical bind. And he says we frequently find ourselves, this bind that we frequently find ourselves in cannot be solved by any formula. Each of us has to decide what the right balance is between being effective and being honest. And I hope that means being both. Now, some people have misinterpreted that to assume that he was advocating for people being dishonest in order to be effective. But that's completely not what he was talking about, and that's a very large misrepresentation of what he was saying. But one of the things that I think could be added to this, and so this is a suggestion for an amendment to this statement, is the recognition that this is a long process, right? And I hope it means being both in terms of efficiency and honesty. It's because without honesty to ourselves, to our audience, to our science, there's no possibility of being effective in a sustainable and responsible way, right? There's a phrase, I don't know who said it first, but if you've convinced me that you're willing to lie to serve your agenda, that's the last thing you'll be ever be able to convince me of, right? And I think it's very important for us as a community to maintain the notion that we need to be effective in a sustainable and a responsible way, because the problems we're dealing with are not going to be dealt with in a week, in 2 weeks, in a year, in 10 years, in 20 years, or 50 years, right? Anything that we do has to be sustainable, and effective and honest advocacy is part of making that happen. And I'll finish with one quote, which kind of goes to the heart of this. This is a quote from Sherwood Rowland, who gave it at the Nobel Prize ceremony when he was receiving the prize for having worked out the chemistry of ozone depletion. And he said, well, what's the use of having developed a science well enough to make predictions if, in the end, all we're willing to do is stand around and wait for them to come true? And so thank you very much again for sitting here, and I hope that wasn't too much of an imposition for you.
Presentation. We have some time for some questions, and I don't know if...
Yeah, I don't know. So,
online.
Yeah.
Thanks for the very thought-provoking talk. I wanted to see if you could comment a little bit on the implications for climate scientists communicating, the implications of the fact that climate scientists are not the only people communicating about climate science. So take, for example, this AMC TV series that's supposed to be coming out soon, Years of Living Dangerously, where celebrity commentators are interviewing experts and people affected by global warming. So what's your opinion? Should climate scientists be running away from that as fast as possible in order to not be painted by the same brush that ends up being painted by, whatever that may be? Or would we do more good by trying to inject some amount of scientific rigor into that enterprise, which arguably is going to have a much larger audience than a journal article?
Right. So generally speaking, when people ask me to talk to them about science, if I have the time, I always talk to them. It doesn't matter whether they're from Fox News or from NPR or like a homemade videographer who wants to make like the killer documentary for next year's Oscars. It's important for people who know things not to cede the public sphere to people who don't know things. Because if we do, then we have this kind of vast hinterland between headlines and journal articles that is populated by people who have very, very different agendas and basically no understanding of the science at all. And so it's just one of those random things. So I think you should engage with these things, and you try and make them as best as good as they can be.
Very good. If you do have questions, please go to the microphone that's in the middle here. Alan, you're next.
But Gavin, I asked you a couple of days ago, should I debate Dick Lindzen, and you said don't waste your time. So
I agree.
What should we do in those situations?
Now you're asking me to advocate. So there are fora in which you can have a serious conversation, and there are fora in which it's almost impossible. Debate situations where you have no, yes, it's just a cacophony, and often is just literally people talking over each other. It serves nobody's purpose other than the producer who thinks they had a fiery segment on their TV show. I don't do those kinds of things. I was on Fox Business News a few months ago, and they tried to set it up as a debate with Roy Spencer, and I said, look, I'm not here to make good TV for you. If you want to ask me questions, if you want to understand what we as a community understand about the science, then I'm happy to talk to you. And I did, and I talked to him, and I explained things. And then he said, oh, well, I've got Roy Spencer over here in the wings. Like, I'm going to bring him on, and now you can have a debate. And I said, no, I don't want to have a debate with people, because it's just noise, and I'm not interested in adding to noise, right? Now, some people are, right? Some people want to add noise into the discussion. And if that's what you're advocating, more noise, and there are people who are doing that, nobody here, then, go ahead. But, the things that I advocate for basically are a higher level of conversation, right? And that means avoiding noise in order to have serious conversations. Wow. So that was good. Yeah. Oh, one more, okay.
So there are a lot of journalists who believe that objectivity means never forming an opinion.
Right.
And so if you have an opinion, you're not objective. Can you talk about how to deal with that?
So in journalism, that's the view from nowhere, right? The idea that I'm just going to report what is, who is saying what, and it's just a reflection of what's happening, and that's the service that I provide to the reader. And that's, it's similar to how we would be a scientist if all we did was sit there, collect data, never sift through it, and then just kind of put out the data set without any kind of filtering, without any kind of analysis. It's not uninteresting. It's not wrong. But it isn't what it is that you want to do. You want people to have judgment. You want people to have discrimination, because we haven't got time to sift through everything ourselves, right? Now you can go back and check out what's going on, but I think we want people to analyze things and tell us what the most key things are, what the balance of the evidence is. And if you talk to other journalists, they'll say, the key value is not objectivity, but truth. And I think the key value for scientists as well should be truth, as best as we can work it out. And that means that you have to be a little bit more than a stenographer when you're doing journalism.
A previous questioner mentioned Richard Lindzen. There are a handful of people with very legitimate scientific credentials who have taken a position on the other side of the global warming debate. You can just about count them on the fingers of both hands. Yeah. It's not a large number. I'm just wondering what your opinion and experience is as to where they're coming from. What is their motivation? Obviously, some of them have become very well known in this process.
Well, so I'm not going to pretend to be a psychologist. So if you forgive me, I'm not going to start speculating about why people do what they do. But I think you should listen to what people have to say, and you should judge for yourself whether the advocacy they're doing is the responsible advocacy that both Steve Schneider and I would have you do, right? If they're being sciencey to hide what it is they're really wanting to talk about, that's a clue. And you should be wise to those clues. And I think you should tell other people what those clues are. So, they have a right to advocate for what they want as much as any of us do. And, we have to accept that if we want the right to advocate for what we want. But I think you should be able to judge whether people are advocating in a responsible or an irresponsible way. And I think that that's the way that you should both approach that and report it.
I have a little disagreement, and I'd like your response to it.
Sure.
The difficulty with not wanting to engage in the noise, I think, is that the noise overwhelms. So
Yes.
how do you deal with the fact that there is no similar restraint on the other side? Is that not a clear question?
No. So I was letting the silence actually permeate because there isn't a lot of noise in this room, right? We can have a discussion about all sorts of things, and we're not being shouted down, right? We could discuss anything, and we would be able to do that. When you're in a situation where people are shouting, either metaphorically or in real life, it's almost impossible to have a serious conversation. And so to communicate what it is that I want to communicate, I find places where the noise level is slower. I don't kind of deliberately go out, create a noise, and then wonder why nobody can hear me speak. So, but there are people who want to create noise, right? And so you know, do I rush to where the loudest noise is to have my little voice be heard? No, that's not very sensible, because that's not where a small voice will be heard, right? I think you have to be tactical about how you communicate. I think you have to be tactical in how you advocate, and you find and create spaces where the noise is outside.
So my question, I guess, to you would be, where would you suggest ways of finding those spaces?
I would avoid, for instance, the comment threads on most major newspapers. Right? You know, in a situation like this, well, okay, I'm here. In some sense, I'm preaching to the converted, so this isn't a particularly effective use of my time. But it's going out online into a relatively quiet environment. You know, you can create spaces online that are, you know, not noise-free and not discussion-free, but that are abuse-free. And I think we should curate spaces like that, like we're doing here, like we have done in the scientific community for decades.
Okay. We have time for 2 more questions, and then we have to stop.
Thank you for a nice talk. I wonder if you have any recommendations on at what stage of your scientific career that you should enter the public debate if you feel that you want to.
So that's a great question. You know, sometimes it's a lot easier to be in a secure job before you start. But when I started blogging and writing letters to the newspaper, like Steve, you know, I was a postdoc soft money researcher with no security or anything, and I, at the time, you know, started saying, "Oh, I'm just going to explain the science to people because, like, they made a mistake. Obviously, they would like to know what the right answer is." So I was very quickly disabused of that notion. But I think it's really a function of where you're coming from, right? If you want to start off, you know, kind of encouraging people to mount the barricades, but you're not doing it from a position where people have trust in your judgment, then that's not going to be very effective. So depending on the stage that you're at, you know, I think you may want to think strategically about what it is that you can achieve effectively, as well as be in line with your values. And I think that's going to change over your career, both as a function of how much you know about the situation, right? I mean, I know a lot more now about climate change and issues and policy and all of the other stuff than I knew when I first started writing letters to the editor. And I think there is that growth that comes along with that, both in learning how to communicate, to whom to communicate, and the rest. And let yourself learn and listen, and then like do it step by step as opposed to kind of jumping in. That would be all I would say.
Thank you.
Okay, I think this is the last one because Bill's fans are coming in. So.
John Nissen, and I run a group called the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, and we've been trying to get through. We've had great trouble. We're unlike most people here, we actually advocate geoengineering as the only possible option to deal with what we consider as an emergency. Right. So what I'm going to ask you is, will you give me permission to start a new blog thread with an opening article?
So that's an interesting question. You know what? I'm going to have to think about it. Come and see me afterwards, and I'll think about it.
I would appreciate a yes, because I think it's very important.
Yes. Well, obviously, the issue would be whether our values on that are shared.
I think our values are shared in terms of what we want to achieve for the planet, for the benefit of the planet.
Okay, I think we're both.
And our argument is for the benefit of the planet, please.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I hope you all stay for the Tyndall History of Global Warming lecture, which will be in about 5 minutes to 2:40. With Bill Rodeman.
So like when you were answering questions, you're talking stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
If you didn't have any questions, but there might be.